This is a presentation on the Culturalist Discourse of English-Only Legislation by Andrew Lovely, Department of Psychology at the University of Northern Iowa. First introduced by Republican Congressman Steve King of Iowa in 2005, again in 2007, and most recently in 2011, the English Language Unity Act proposes to declare the English language as the official language of the United States. If passed, this law would require all official government functions to be conducted in English. Currently, the government is obligated to provide interpreters and translations to denizens who have limited English proficiency. Representative Steve King and other sponsors of this bill maintain that providing multilingual services comes at great fiscal cost and is a disincentive for immigrants to learn English. To date, 31 states have passed similar legislation declaring English as the official language. Another manifestation of the English-only movement involves the stemming of bilingual education. In 2000, Arizona voters approved legislation to stop bilingual education in the state and to implement English immersion programs. The bill attributed high dropout rates and low English literacy among immigrants to failed and costly bilingual education programs and called for all courses thenceforth to be taught solely in English. English language learners often spend up to 4 hours a day in English immersion classes, in which all instruction is in English and all their classmates are roughly at the same level of proficiency. Supporters of English-only legislation acknowledge that English literacy is crucial for getting by in the United States, and they cite this as one of their principal reasons for advancing this sort of legislation. In an op-ed written by Mauro Mujica, chairman of the board and CEO of U.S. English, an organization leading the effort to make English the official language of the United States, readers are urged to consider the difficulties faced by immigrants not fluent in English. Mr. Mujica and others believe that without English being the official language, there is insufficient incentive for immigrants to learn the language and thus will be at a social and economic disadvantage relative to Anglophones. Perhaps the most often cited reason for advancing English-only legislation concerns the integrity of the American nation. Former Republican Congressman Tom Tancredo of Colorado has frequently made the claim that the United States risks splitting apart along ethno-linguistic lines if English is not made the official language and if immigration continues unabated. Representative Steve King has put forth similar concerns, saying, quote, "A common language is the most powerful unifying force throughout history, throughout all humanity, and all time. If people can't communicate, they're bound to separate." Relatedly, the political scientist Samuel P. Huntington warned that the United States was on track to becoming, quote, "a bifurcated nation with English-speaking and Spanish-speaking entities confronting each other." Critics of English-only legislation overall believe that the laws are unnecessary and discriminatory. They note that immigrants are very aware of the benefit of learning English while in the United States. It's not that immigrants do not want to learn English, they say, it's that there's a lack of educational resources available for them to do so. In the case of the law in Arizona banning bilingual education, English language learners often find themselves socially alienated and academically disadvantaged due to being in English immersion classes for up to 4 hours each school day. The American Civil Liberties Union wrote in a position paper concerning English-only laws that rather than serving to increase English proficiency, these laws simply discriminate and punish those who have not yet learned the language. Not only that, but the ACLU argues that these laws violate the First Amendment right to communicate with or petition the government, as well as the right to equal protection. In trying to understand what motivates some people to support English-only laws, we can consult some of the literature in social psychology regarding political orientation. Virtually all the politicians advancing English-only legislation are social conservatives in the Republican Party. What social psychologists have found is that self-described conservatives tend to endorse right-wing authoritarianism, which consists of a commitment to convention, a respect for authority, and aggression toward those who don't conform. In addition, conservatism is often operationalized as being resistant to change as well as to accepting social inequality. Finally, moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt has found that conservatives tend to prize loyalty to their in-group relative to liberals. All of these psychological qualities could combine to fuel an opposition to other languages gaining prominence in a country where English has long been the dominant language and to some a defining feature of their national identity. Which brings us to the next point. People who consider English to be a defining feature of the American nation are operating from a particular ontology of nationhood. In other words, people differ in how they understand the nature of nationhood. Assuming that nations are communities of individuals who share a distinct culture differentiating them from members of other nations represents a form of cultural essentialism. While anthropologists largely oppose this conception of culture as a bounded and reified property of a particular group of people, this is how it is understood by many lay people. In the context of human migration, people who have an essentialist understanding of culture and of nationhood are likely to grow anxious about the implications immigration has for their nation. As the political theorist Biku Parekh has noted, people who think of the nation as, quote, an extended family representing one language, one culture, one people, and one national culture, believe that the nation should at all costs avoid dilution and loss of its internal coherence. This clearly describes the nature of the English-only proponents' concerns. Finally, it should be pointed out that English-only proponents are wont to use the language of assimilation, and this is perfectly consistent given a cultural essentialist conception of the nation. They're not concerned with immigrants thought to be of another race per se, but with the cultural baggage they bring with them. So long as immigrants leave their culture at the border and eagerly adopt the so-called American culture, that is what matters. Inferring the psychological foundations of the opposition to English-only legislation proves more difficult, in part because the psychology of liberalism has received considerably less attention than conservatism has. Psychologists have found that self-described liberals tend to be more open to novel experiences than conservatives, and this might partly explain the absence of anxiety about what languages people speak in the United States. With regard to moral foundations, liberals also tend to be more concerned with social justice and equality, which could manifest as the belief that all denizens of the United States are entitled to speak the language they please. Given the previous discussion about lay ontologies of the nation, it's very possible that opponents of English-only legislation share a different understanding of what constitutes the American nation. People who regard the American nation as an ever-evolving amalgamation of various cultural influences would probably not be motivated to insist on making English or any other particular language the official language of the United States. To them, perhaps the American nation is defined by its cultural pluralism, and that is what needs to be protected rather than the ideal of cultural homogeneity that is so earnestly guarded by English-only proponents. Much of the debate over whether or not the English language ought to be the official language of the United States ignores the underlying assumptions people have about what constitutes the American nation. English-only proponents are often simply regarded as racist and closed-minded bigots by those who disagree with their politics. For any progress to be made on this issue, we must be speaking the same language, that is, directly conversing about what it means to be American. Is there actually an authentic American culture that must be coveted and protected from impure elements brought in from outside the borders? One thing that is notably absent from the debate over English-only legislation is the fact of globalization. It is arguable that it is futile and perhaps fallacious too to protect this ideal of a pure American culture against the natural and ever-increasing flow of people and culture across geopolitical borders. Lastly, we cannot rely on simple facts to advance this debate. The actual levels of English proficiency among immigrants is largely irrelevant to English-only proponents because that is not the underlying issue they're concerned with. Honestly, the facts do not support their case, given that immigrants across the board assimilate linguistically at much the same rate and in the same pattern as they had in the past. Despite being repeatedly exposed to this data, English-only proponents remain skeptical and continue on with their cause. What is really motivating their concern is their particular abstraction of the American people, which Arturo Rosenbluth and Norbert Wiener poignantly point out is impervious to facts. If a resolution can be achieved on this perennial issue, we need to talk directly about who we are and what we should anticipate living in a globalizing world of today and of the future.